Hello and welcome to the Product Shipping Forecast, where we help you navigate the treacherous waters of product development. I'm Rob, a product designer at Zero Height, and I'm joined by my co-host and product engineering colleague, Rosie.
Hiya.
So, Rosie, we're a few weeks into the new year, and it felt somewhat appropriate to focus this month's episode on management, and I guess particularly line management, because I think that's something we've both kind of had a little bit of experience in. But also, I think, the start of a new year kind of encourages people to think about, their career path and where they're kind of going with their kind of career goals. I mean, I do definitely, just from having had that long Christmas break, I'm usually kind of thinking about where things are going. So, yeah, I thought it'd kind of be interesting to dip into that. And also, I know you've started picking up a bit more line management at Zero Height, as we've had a few new joiners start in the last couple of weeks. So that must be pretty exciting as well.
Yeah, it's definitely nice to get back into it. I've had sort of a little break from managing just one engineer, which was always quite nice to do. But sadly, they left Zero Height. Obviously, very happy for them to get a new job. But gave me a sort of a 4-month break and now back at it again. Which I'll also be picking up extra as well. So I'm very much used to being managing one person, which is lovely. It means they get a lot of attention. But yeah, with Paul, one of the engineering managers, taking a sabbatical. Now he's been here for 5 years. I believe I'm taking on some extra reports, so it's going to be my first time at managing a small group of engineers as well.
Nice. I'm quite excited to dig into that a little bit more, and also kind of hear a bit about what you might try and do differently this time, having had a bit of a break between, because I think that's quite rare for a lot of people. But I think firstly, just to kind of kick off this conversation, why do you think so many people, particularly in design and engineering, look at management as kind of where they want their career to go?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's definitely one I could have related to at some point. And I think a lot of it comes from progression, right? You're kind of, I think especially when you're in the tech world, your whole career is about progressing. It's how can I get further? What can I do to keep improving and getting better? And I think because the tech world's still a relatively new thing, right? You go back 40 years and it wasn't such an obvious area to get into. I think we then end up sort of applying very general rules to it. So you look back at your parents and the way they would progress, my parents would go from being nurses to then managing the nurses, and that was how they furthered their career as they got older. So I was always under the same assumption, that's what you do. And that obviously is a very legitimate path in both design and engineering, right? You can't be a manager straight off the bat. You do need to have actually, well, you don't technically, but I think for most people it's much better if you've actually done the job first before then managing people who are doing that job. And it feels sometimes like the only way to progress, because it is hard to progress up this invisible ladder otherwise. It depends on the company you're at, Some companies do only have, when I joined Zero Height, there were no roles. Everyone was just an engineer, and there was no hierarchy. And that was great at the time because there was such a small group of us that it didn't make sense to have a massive hierarchy. But it did also mean oh, cool, what am I necessarily aiming for? You can't particularly write it down on paper. It's kind of hard. Whereas saying oh, cool, yeah, you can work to be an engineering manager. You're oh, okay, yeah, that seems like a better thing. But I do think people are maybe starting to reflect on the fact that it doesn't have to be everybody's next step. Management isn't necessarily always progression, and it's definitely not the only way to progress. So I think people are, at least I am as well, starting to think is that the only thing I want, or is actually there are other things I want to move towards? I've sort of made a lot of assumptions. It's the same in design, but yeah. Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it is quite similar. I think, as you say, there's a lot of legacy hang-ups around how kind of career paths work, and I think it's very rooted in a more traditionalist way of businesses kind of operating, quite large enterprise level orgs where you kind of move up the ranks, you work there for most of your career, right? You look at our parents' generation compared to now, where it's much more expected that you move around every couple of years, especially early in your career, right? To kind of either get more seniority or get more experience, rather than so many of our kind of older peers would probably have like stuck in the same job for like 20, 30 years. And I've certainly worked with some of those at bigger corporates. And I think it kind of instilled a bit of a mentality in like, that's just how you progress. But I think the tricky thing, especially with, our respective fields, design and development are very like hands-on. They're very kind of like, they're very driven by like contributions, and people are passionate about doing that work. That I think can be quite tricky squaring that circle of, the career path progression is often do less of it in favor of doing a bit more kind of like people management. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think that is often worth reflecting on, like, what is it about the role that you actually like and what is it you kind of look for. I think the other thing, I guess, that's maybe a bit specific to the sort of design world is if you look at more kind of like historic design roles, so particularly thinking about like in more kind of like the graphic design, sort of visual design kind of end of the spectrum, you did have a lot more of that kind of, you start up as a designer or a creative designer, you then move into like a creative director kind of role where you might be managing people, but you're much more kind of applying that kind of like strategic sort of like design approach. I think, obviously, people think of like Don Draper from Mad Men, right? As that kind of like quintessential, like he's still delivering pitches, he's still doing strategy, like he's still, positioning like large scale thoughts, but then, you're more junior, you're more kind of like mid-level are doing more of the grunt work. And that is true maybe if we'll still think about agencies like operating the way they do. But I think most sort of tech companies especially, are quite small. You are often, especially on the design side, a single designer working in a squad. Like you reach a point where there isn't really much seniority to get to outside of, maybe principals, staff, or then going into the kind of like head of design sort of space. So I think there's been a bit of a tension about figuring out like what is that kind of next step, especially once you kind of hit a certain level of seniority. Yeah.
No, I think that's definitely hard. And I think a lot of it's also coming to the realisation that sometimes it is okay to like stop and enjoy what you're doing as well. And not necessarily have to keep pushing and reaching whatever that next title is. And also realising that there's a lot of title inflation out there. And one job doesn't compare to another when you read titles, I think it can sometimes be super clear when I get a message on LinkedIn and it'll be like senior engineer and they'll be offering like 20 grand and you're like, that's not a senior. Like if a senior engineer is accepting that, somebody needs to talk to them. Versus, if you were to get like a senior engineer at Facebook and they're paying you, ridiculous amounts of money. And so, it's hard to compare them. And I think that can sometimes be an added difficulty when it comes to thinking about your career and whether or not you're progressing and doing it enough. But I guess that maybe kind of leads me on to like, why did you end up getting into line management when you did? Like, what was the story behind that? How did you fall into it?
Very much fell into it. I guess I've only done line management like once in my career, and it did kind of put me off a little bit. Put me off, or maybe just confirmed that it wasn't really necessarily what I was kind of after. But basically, I was working for a startup that had gone through like some turbulence in its kind of like headcount, and I was sort of basically the longest serving designer in that team, and I think partly to appease me and keep me happy, I was given additional responsibilities. But I think also, there was a certain level of like wanting to like ensure kind of like a sort of consistency across, from one phase where we'd had like a slightly larger team, we'd scaled down, I'd become like the only designer due to circumstances, let's say. And we were then hiring backup. And so I think they wanted someone who kind of was leading the team, who knew a little bit more about the context and history of like where the design team had been at, where the product had been at, what we're trying to do, rather than necessarily get someone brand new in to kind of head things up. And they certainly weren't looking for someone at like a head of design kind of level. So I kind of stepped into more of a principal design role, and was kind of line managing two other designers at the time. And it was an interesting experience. I learned a lot through that, but I also, made a lot of mistakes. And I think, one of the things that maybe we can talk about is like the support for stepping into line management is, I think, often quite lacking in a lot of places. There's an expectation that, I think you kind of hinted at this earlier, like just because you're a good designer or a good developer doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a good manager or know necessarily how best to kind of manage people within your kind of like field, because it's a very different set of skills, and it requires very different things out of you to kind of like work at. Like I think a lot of like my biggest mistakes were how much like I was able to actually protect the team. I think you know, one of the designers that we hired had come from like more of a marketing background, and we're kind of keen to get more into the product side of things. So we'd hired them as like a fairly junior product designer, with the idea that they'd be able to do a little bit of like support for marketing, a little bit of kind of like UI sort of stuff, and then myself and the other product designer who were a bit more experienced on the UX side will kind of help bring them into kind of more of the UX world. And that sort of started off kind of working quite nicely. I was kind of being the kind of point of the contact for any marketing requests and just sort of funneling them out. But once this designer sort of started working on a little bit of marketing stuff, the marketing team realized that they were actually really good at that, because obviously they'd been doing it for many years, and started going to them directly. And I didn't clock immediately that there was like this additional pressure being put on this person, and probably should have been a bit more aware of that. And again, we can get into this a bit later about like I was also like trying to balance being an IC at the same time. So just trying to make sure that like the team was like well insulated and actually kind of supported in the right way was quite tricky. And I think that was the big thing that I kind of took away from that experience was, you know, companies will sometimes say like it's only going to be part of your job, but actually it is so much more to line management. It isn't just about the one-to-ones. It is about kind of, you know, constantly being aware of like what are they working on, what is happening, and how best can you know, make sure they're getting the right kind of support in their role. But how about you?
Mine was also very accidental, kind of. I was going through the crisis of how do I further my career. Didn't really know what I was doing, and I always assumed that management would be the way I'd do it. I'd never necessarily seen myself as like the most technical person. Rightly or wrongly so, I still don't necessarily know, but I never necessarily have felt like that was my thing. I was much more like about people, processing, like getting teams working. So I was like, I want to try line management, and I was basically lucky enough to be given the opportunity, because we had 2 new joiners starting. Myself and someone else was also trying out line management for the first time. They gave up within a month, so they knew it wasn't for them. I, however, continued. And yeah, so far, well, I do now manage someone else, but was for a while the only person I managed for, over 2 years, which was lovely. I felt like I got a lot of support, but I think it was a lot because I was quite forward about needing the support. I essentially could rely on my own manager quite a lot. Who is also the head of engineering, has lots of experience like managing, and probably like managing managers as well. So was like super helpful when I had questions about things or just needed some like advice and guidance. So that was quite nice. I think I had similar issues in terms of sort of the things I look back on and I'm like, oh yeah, that was harder than I thought. And I think because I'm very used to myself, right? When I go into my one-to-ones, I am painfully honest, very open, and will sort of bring everything to the table and be like, this is what's happening. These are my problems. Help. And I think it was quite easy for me to forget that other people might not do that and might not necessarily be able to be as open and honest. And I think this comes back to the story you were telling about the person who was then ending up being sort of like asked by marketing to do loads of stuff behind the scenes. If they don't come to you and necessarily say that, it's so much harder to step in and help because you don't always know it's happening, and you can't necessarily have that conversation. And I sort of had similar things where it's like the team, the person I was managing, been put into was like, they were working on a really difficult project. It was like really technical. It was not very fun. It, you know, given that at Zero Height were all product engineers, it was not very producty because it was just replacing our editor. And yeah, I think I should have spotted sooner that it maybe wasn't the best place for someone that didn't have loads of experience as a software engineer to be. But I think I took too long to realise that sort of thing and wished that I'd been able to help them sooner and get them and move them into a different team, which is what eventually happened. And lots of things got so much better after that. But I think sometimes when people, you haven't necessarily built up the relationship with the person you're managing for them to be honest and open, and be able to just come to you and tell you what's wrong. You have to try and find these things out for yourself. I think that's a skill you don't always come to the table with immediately.
Yeah, I think that point you make about, everyone is kind of different, and so having to learn, the people you manage and what their kind of specific needs might be. Are they super open and honest with you? Are they the sort of person who's going to come in and be quite confident to be here are the issues I'm having, let's talk about them? Mm-hmm. Or are they someone who is going to need a little bit more kind of support and mentoring to kind of take things a bit further? I think that's always kind of an interesting challenge, and definitely takes time. It's not something you're going to get overnight, and you're going to have to work at it. And it means that, I think my mistake was I was managing kind of two designers, and I did kind of treat them both in very similar ways. And I sort of treated our kind of one-to-ones and catch-ups in the way that I had catch-ups with other sort of designers, head of design and stuff in the past. When really what I should have been doing is trying to figure out what actually makes more sense based on their experience level and their kind of level of comfort. I think the other challenge though as well was, I didn't have that kind of same support structure. There was no other senior designer in the company I was working at the time. I reported directly into the CPO, and our catch-ups were much less frequent. And I think also they were probably properly line managing for the first time in a while as well. They had, used to product people sort of reporting into them, but being much less developing the product managers and more just let's talk about strategy, product strategy, and where things are going. And that was a lot of our conversations was let's talk about design strategy and where that's going. But at the same time, they weren't a designer, they weren't super close to what designers doing, and so had less of that kind of input. And looking back, what would have probably been helpful is looking for kind of assistance outside of the company to kind of help support some of that, or help mentor me into stepping up to, kind of management at that level.
Yeah, I think definitely seeking outside help can be good, and you can start off with the basic things like books and stuff, but I think talking to other people, because I have spoken to a few people sort of outside Zero Height about some of this stuff, but also looking inside, me and Paul, the actual engineering manager who manages lots of people, we have conversations sometimes, because at this point he's got a lot more experience than me because he's worked with so many different people and been through so many different scenarios, so it's always helpful. But I think the other thing that I can kind of pull out of that story you told there that I feel I can relate to is where you are in relation to the people you're managing. So sort of when you were managing, it sounds like you were in the same team as the other designers, and so you were sort of working with them on a daily basis, and that definitely builds a different type of relationship than say the one you had with the CPO, where you're not working together. And I think that was something I definitely had to combat and don't really know how I feel about it yet. But the person that I managed for 2 years, we never worked in the same product squad. And so I was always kind of somewhat peering in from the side and trying to work things out. And it definitely meant we maybe built a different relationship than if we'd been in the same product squad together. And that's different for me this time around. The person I'm currently managing is in the same product squad as me, which means we'll hopefully work together a bit more on a day-to-day basis. And so hopefully we can maybe build a different relationship that might make it easier to understand sort of what's going on.
See, that's interesting, because I would almost view it slightly differently. In my head it feels like it would make more sense for the person you line manage to be in a separate squad, to kind of create that kind of safety of like, it's not someone you're working with day to day. If you have kind of like concerns or grievances, to be able to air them to like a neutral party is something I'd view as like being quite useful in that sense. And I think actually like with the designers I was managing, like we were all in separate squads. Like same way that we work at Zero Height now is like I was in a squad working on stuff, the other product designers working in a squad, and then the kind of like the designer who'd kind of come from the marketing background, I think was working a bit close with like our web teams, and so being a bit more kind of like, because that was a bit more kind of like sort of UI focused and a bit more kind of like visual, that was kind of like really playing into their skill sets. So I sort of tried to handle things that way. But it did mean that we weren't like super close. But then I guess like we had like design crits and stuff. So we would, outside of our one-to-ones, have like the three of us get together and like chat through work and stuff like that. But I think again that was why the marketing issue didn't kind of come up as much, because we would talk a lot about the product work, and then the small bits of marketing stuff that was being worked on was kind of getting very quick turnaround, was never quite anything that was being brought up at Crit, and then maybe should have realised that like there was additional stuff that was happening that wasn't being seen, that was being seen when it kind of like was something like, oh, marketing are running this campaign, and like, where did these assets come from? They did not just come out of the thin air.
Or did they? Yeah. No, I definitely know what you mean about being a different team, and like this is something I've gone back and forth on, because I mean, for myself personally, I would hate to be in the same team as my manager. I would probably not enjoy that. And I do think there are pros to it, as you say, in terms of like having someone that you're not working with to talk to. And I think the time that I think it's good to have your manager in your team is maybe when you're on the more junior end of the scale, when actually like having someone that can be closer to you, mentor you, make sure that you're getting the sort of like day-to-day help that you need, I think is where having a manager in the same team is helpful. I think if you are on the like more senior end of the scale and you've got your footing a little bit better and you know how to bring up an issue and raise an issue, that's when I think actually you don't really gain anything from having a manager in the same team. I also think if you do have your manager in the same team, it's then good to, I know something that we do at Zero Height is the head of engineering will check in with the person I manage every so often, just every now and again, basically just to make sure that the person I manage knows that if they have a problem with me or anything that's working around, like there is somebody else to talk to, so that they don't just feel like, oh, I can't say anything because my manager is in my team, so I can't talk badly about anything. But yeah, there's definitely pros and cons there.
Yeah, I think the way you kind of describe that definitely makes sense. I think you're right in recognising that where people need a bit more support, having the kind of like connection to the manager being much closer definitely sounds like it makes a lot more sense. I think you're right. Like it's maybe once you get to a slightly more senior level, having a bit of a distance is probably useful. I guess like the thing that I think is true of both of us in terms of our experience of management is we've not solely been managers, right? We've always been ICs as well. Like, how have you found kind of like balancing your own work with the responsibilities of like line management?
On a day-to-day basis, pretty easy. Arguably trivial. When things are going quite well and there's not really anything extra on, it maybe takes like a couple of hours out of my week. I'll have a nice one-to-one chat. I'll, do a bit of prep beforehand to make sure I'm covering off any topics. I'll follow up with any queries or concerns afterwards. And that's kind of it. And so I found for the majority of the time when I was managing one person, it wasn't particularly intrusive. And if anything, it was almost kind of like a nice thing to do, just to catch up with somebody else. Also, because the person I was managing was in a different team, it was a good way to make sure I was even staying up to date with what the other team was working on. So I actually found it quite helpful. I think the times when it's not helpful are sort of like growth check-in periods or onboarding periods when you do suddenly have to dedicate a lot more time. And because it's not something you're doing all the time, I'll be honest, every time it comes around, I always have a little bit of a like muddle, and I'm all of a sudden, turning to the team and I'm like, I'm going to be a bit all over the place this week because I've suddenly got to, write loads of feedback and read through other feedback and collate it all together and go to all these like meetings where we make sure that nobody's, you know, being biased about the way they're reviewing someone. That's where it starts to get a little bit like, whoa.
I definitely resonate with that. I only had to really do like one big performance cycle when I was line managing, but it was such a shock as to like how much needed to be done, because it was like, as you say, I was doing my own kind of like self-evaluation. I was like writing feedback for other peers who like requested it for like, you know, the PM or developers. And then I was also having to kind of chase people for feedback on the people I was managing, having to write the manager feedback on the people I was managing, kind of collate that all together, organize sessions to like run through like the feedback and what that meant. Fortunately, it was all positive, which is great. So didn't have to have any like awkward conversations there, which I've never had to deal with, and I'm kind of glad about that. But it did also then feed into like having to, you know, fight for like pay rises and stuff like that. That was an interesting experience of like trying to have to kind of negotiate that, especially at a time where I felt like I was quite heavily underpaid.
Trying to fight for your own and everyone else's, excuse me.
So it just kind of like definitely added like a lot of additional work in like a very concentrated time that was just like, I'm not getting any design work done at this point. I think for me, like my biggest challenge was, as I mentioned, I'd gone from being like a sole designer to having like, you know, being part of a team of 3 with the 2 other designers reporting into me. And the difficulty there was actually like letting go of like having to be across everything. Like I think early on I was like maybe trying to be a bit too across everything and be like, you know, because I've been working on a lot of these projects anyway until we like hired up and until people were ready to kind of like start working on stuff, being able to like suddenly take a step back and say, okay, I'm not working with the iOS team anymore. And also having to like, because people would still come to me with questions and having to like be like, no, this question goes to this person now.
Other people.
But, you know, in the back of my head, I've got that super, you know, helpful, always wanting to be helpful, always wanting to jump in with a suggestion kind of thing, where it's like immediately trying to jump in and like resolve a thing, or like I get a question about, should we be doing it this way? And I'm immediately about to like type in a response being like, I don't think we should design, and going, no, that's another designer's work. Somebody else answers this. It goes to them first. If they are unsure, they can come to me with questions. But like having to like establish boundaries was like the really tricky thing there, and start to accept that I can't possibly see everything that is being worked on. It's definitely kind of like a tricky level. I guess it's maybe a little different on the engineering side.
I was about to say, so different, because it didn't really change my role at all, and I think that was where, obviously, like again, being in a completely different team, like I was never really at a point where I was like, oh, don't want to tread on toes or whatever. Like I am still very much just like a product engineer, so I still do want to be, you know, in on all those conversations and chatting about that, versus maybe, you know, like Paul we have who now is solely an engineering manager, so you do see him take a bit more of a back seat, and I can definitely see it's a struggle sometimes, because he was one of the original engineers that built a lot of the product, and now he obviously doesn't work directly on it, so does have to sort of, you know, step back, and I can see how that's hard. And I think the angle that I had that was more hard was almost the kind of the reverse of that, in a way of more, sometimes like decisions or things were made by other people, and then I would have to sort of like convey an unknown message to the person I was managing. So, you know, if things do happen, like redundancies or things like that, and obviously I have literally no input in them, and generally don't get a heads up in lots of them, because it's not a matter that needs to be told to someone that's just managing a couple of people. And then going into one-to-ones and being like, I don't really have much more information for you than what is shared with everyone. And that could happen a few times. And there's also sometimes, obviously, companies make decisions, right? And as individuals, we don't always agree with every decision that's made. But you have to like put on a little like manager hat sometimes and be like, this is why the decision was made. You know, like it was thought through, the company is doing this. versus like wanting to turn around and being like, yeah, I don't agree with it either. Isn't it terrible? And having a little gossip. Just like making sure there's sometimes a little line drawn of like, no, okay, this is manager moment.
I've definitely had to do a few of those, not so much like redundancies, but definitely like changes of strategy. Like, again, being like the more senior designer, I'd be a bit more privy to this. I remember there was like one specific case. There's actually someone else I managed having to kind of like deliver the news that a project they've been working on, we essentially like pulled the plug on it because it had just been, it had kind of like, the reality of like what we were going to be able to build just wasn't there. And so having to kind of like have that conversation, knowing that like, it, like you say, I was in complete agreement with them that it was like a bullshit decision. We should have just committed to it. Like, it wasn't that hard and it was kind of necessary. But having to kind of just relay that information, take questions, and also the pain of often just being able to be just having to say like, I unfortunately I don't know if we're going to be able to pick this up again.
Middlemanning everything and being I need to talk to someone else and then I'll let you know. Yep. And
I would genuinely try and like follow up on that stuff, but like you would then get, like other people can then stonewall you a little bit, and that doesn't really get anywhere. And that's always like, that's definitely the hard part, because I think you want to, like, it's very different to like working with like peers, right, where you can kind of just be mates and go to the pub after work and have a moan about the state of things. But the moment you've got like a sort of like a manager kind of level, or you're slightly more privy to things and you've got to like tread carefully, it becomes a lot harder to kind of be in that space, which I always found quite uncomfortable.
I think the thing I find difficult is my face gives a lot away. I'm always told my face. And so sometimes when there are like topics, like if I happen to like know somebody's like handed in their notice and it's just not like been announced yet, and I'm just there trying to like keep a really straight face if someone's talking about something, and I'm like, I know nothing. It is always weird. I think there's ways to like break it down. Like, I know when I go to the pub with my manager, I maybe don't hold back as much as I would with like maybe other people that have been my managers in the past. And I think it's knowing that they've drawn like that boundary line of like, cool, you're outside of work now. Like, as long as you don't do anything awful, feel free to have a little bit of a moan while you're at the pub, because that's kind of that's how you get through life with your job, right?
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is establishing the right levels of conversation, and also like being super clear. Like, just because someone's told you something, that might be in confidence, and that might not be something they want relayed elsewhere. So if it is something in that kind of space, like making sure they're comfortable with you kind of bringing that up, or whether they'd like it raised but in an anonymous way, or whatever the case may be. Obviously it's a lot harder if you're only managing one person, because it might be a bit more obvious where that has come from.
I have an anonymous tip-off from one of the people I manage. Yep.
But I think also, I like, especially when I was doing line management, I wanted like the rest of the team to be open and honest with me. I didn't want them to feel like they couldn't say something, because sometimes it is healthy to have a bit of a rant and a moan about things, and to just be that kind of like supportive ear. I think it's more that, like I say, you got to know when they just want to rant versus they actually want to raise something, and for you to kind of like take that and escalate that appropriately.
I guess that sort of leads on to like a nice little question of, what do you wish you'd done better? If you could go back and redo it, what would you change?
I think for me, like I said, I mentioned working to be a little bit more aware of like what people are working on, not necessarily in terms of the specifics, but like understanding like, is their workload okay? Are they feeling the pressure of it? Because I think often, it can be quite difficult, especially if you've started somewhere new, to understand like what is a healthy level of work. You see everyone around, like it's the curse of like people always being like, I'm really busy. That was actually one thing I did learn, was like to stop saying that I was busy, especially to people who reported to me. Like I could be busy, but I was actually, I should never be too busy for them, was like a key thing. And I think helping to better establish like what is a healthy balance of work when is it right for them to say no, or when is it right for them to come to me and say like, hey, I got a bit too much on my plate, could you help, or could you, you know, chat to X person and say like, I can't pick anything else up, or, you know, could I be more kind of like forward and like, hey, any request coming from like, these are product designers, they are not marketing designers. If marketing has a request, it comes to me first, and then I decide who gets to work on it based on what I know about everyone's workload. You don't get to speak to the designers about what you need because that's not your remit. So I think that's, for me, is like the big thing I would probably change, is just trying to have a bit more awareness and trying to encourage that kind of like healthier balance a little bit more, and establish, just make sure like people are working in a healthy way, because I think it's so easy, especially early, to establish like bad habits that can then be very difficult to break someone out of, even if it is something that they need to do.
Yeah.
How about yourself? Like, what are you kind of like hoping to do better this time?
It will probably be very different this time, because I think the thing I would hope to do better is kind of in relation to if you're managing across a different team. Like the thing I wish I'd done sooner was talk to the other engineers in the team. I was kind of going purely based off what I could see from the outside. So like, you know, looking at the team Slack and just chatting to the person I managed, which gave me like a good chunk of the story, but maybe sort of didn't give me the overall view, because I didn't necessarily know fully what the other team was working on. Like I knew they were moving editors, but that didn't tell me anything about sort of like the day-to-day work. And the person I was managing maybe, you know, wasn't certain how much they should or shouldn't be doing, and because they didn't know who to compare themselves to, and I probably didn't have enough information on that. And I think I probably could have helped them out by moving them to a nicer squad much quicker. If I'd have sort of talked to the other members of the team and realised that maybe it wasn't the best environment for a new engineer to be, because it was an awful project. And, you know, even people that had been at the company for a while were having a terrible time on it. And I think I took it for granted that I would be able to get the full story from just chatting to the person I manage and from like reading around, looking around a bit. And I think, in the future, I'd want to talk to more people. And I think I'll still carry that forward. With sort of, you know, even though I'm in the same team as the new person I'm managing, I think it's still good that I chat to the, you know, the other engineers, the PM, the designer, i.e. you, and just like sense check that everyone, you know, is like, oh yeah, everything seems good. Like I've not heard any issues. I'm not like seeing anything weird. Like things are going well, versus sort of like leaving it till it gets to kind of more of like a stressful point and then trying to like backtrack and work through it all and be like, oh God, have I been a terrible manager by sort of letting things get a little out of control and you know, maybe giving someone a terrible first experience with a company and then trying to make it a bit better from there. But yeah, I like to think I did. She stayed for another year and a half. So hopefully I made up for the beginning part. But yeah, that's definitely something I will do in the future is cast a wider net on the people I speak to understand how things are going.
And I think even in that, like there's that tricky balance of, you know, you mentioned, you know, it's not quite the same in engineering, but for me, you know, like having to divest myself of like all the projects I was looking at, like it's something I've often struggled with, because like sometimes I can do that a bit too much and try and just go really like hands off, like no, I'm not interested in that. And we could probably talk at length about like my experiences of going from being a sole designer to a designer in a team, because I've done that a couple of times now, and trying to like balance like being a bit more hands off, allowing people to make their own decisions. Like that was a big thing I struggled with when I was line managing, was like, you know, how much should I be validating the decisions they're making? How much should I be nudging them in the right direction? How much do I want to try and avoid just pushing my own opinion on what they're doing? And, you know, make sure I'm not making them feel disempowered because, the guy who's been here for like 2 years has like got an opinion. You know, like I came from like, you know, having spent 2 years working on like trying to build up this product, and knowing all the background and trying not to be the person of like, oh well, we can't do this because we've always done it this way, or no, we've tried that in the past and it didn't work, so we're not going to do it again. Because I hate those people myself. Like, the people who've been at a company for like 5 years and they're like, no, well, this is just the way it is. It's like, you want people who are confident in asking questions, but yeah, that kind of taking their hands off the tiller and but doing it in the right way, that you're not just like leaving them to kind of like flounder without any kind of support is very tricky, I think. I guess like on the other side, like not in terms of like what would you do better, but like what do you think makes for a good manager?
Maybe this varies by person, but when I think of like the managers I've appreciated the most, and if I think back to like the positive bits of feedback I've had, I think for me the bit that stands out is sort of being fairly personable, being someone that doesn't, sort of like act like a robot, and they just like reading off a script and they ask you like the same 2 questions each week. It's like, what's gone well? What hasn't gone well? And you never really feel like you're having a true, open and honest conversation. I think knowing that you can bring things to the table, like I remember when I was first getting to know my current manager, and one of the sort of phrases that I used was like, take some of the things I say with like a pinch of salt. Because sometimes if something's just annoyed me, or if there's lots of things, like sometimes I'll like just have a bit of a rant and I don't necessarily need anything to be done about it, and it just needs to be taken away. The other things are sort of being able to relate to them. So also having a manager that, not always, as you say, based on what you've just said, but does sometimes talk about their experiences. And it's one of the like positive pieces of feedback I got on the last time I was a manager, was actually sometimes being able to explain a situation based on something that's happened with me. And quite often like a case where it's been like something that's gone wrong that I've like looked back on and rectified, or anything like that. It makes you suddenly realise that the person that is managing you, or you as manager, is actually also just a normal person. They've done the job before, which I would also argue, as a side note, is a very key thing to a good manager. I've had managers before that haven't been engineers, and they've just been like general people managers, and they were very good at some things, but there was some parts where it was hard to kind of get your point across because they didn't necessarily understand that part of the job. So if you were having difficulties with the way something was set up, or two teams were sort of trying to work out how to do something and couldn't agree, and then your manager doesn't have any clue about it, it can be really hard to have that conversation. And then that's when I've definitely felt lost in the past. So I think also knowing the job and being willing to talk about it and talk about past experiences probably makes a very good manager, at least in my eyes.
Yeah, I definitely agree somewhat with that last point. Like I definitely don't subscribe to the idea that like great designers make great design managers necessarily. No. But I think having some awareness of the process and like how to kind of approach it is definitely super useful. I think some of the best managers I've had have been the managers where like, if I'm like really struggling with a project or finding a way forward for something, that they can turn around and say, well, have you thought about using this method? Like often like, and especially like if you're managing people a bit earlier in their career, like that is so important to be able to like open people up to new ways of working, to kind of like really thinking about things in different ways. And I think that's kind of where maybe the difference is with design compared to development, is like design has a lot more like softer skills. There's a lot of like kind of, processes you're going to use that aren't going to give you like necessarily a tangible outcome, but about trying to get you to think differently or unlock insights differently. It's not good enough to like turn, I've had so many people turn around and be like, oh, just go to test it, like go out to a coffee shop and like test an idea. And it's like, that never works, because it only works in the US where people are happy to be bothered when they're in a coffee shop. Yeah. If you do that in the UK. London, like no one's going to be interested, or it will just be other people who work for tech companies, and they're not good people for feedback often, unless you're working on a tech product. I think someone who like understands the field and can kind of give you a bit of that, the right level of guidance, I think, yeah, like someone who's personable that you can be open with and speak to. I think so much of good line management is about making sure it's a judgment-free space, like a place where you can feel comfortable talking about, not just the things that are frustrating you, but also like being able to reflect on maybe mistakes you've made and be able to not feel like you're getting blamed for that, or it's like, that's the mark that's going against you when you're looking to get a pay rise in 6 months.
You won't be getting a pay rise because you've made one mistake in the past 6 months. Yeah.
I think definitely that. And like, again, like you say, someone who can also relate their experiences. I think, I don't want to ever like rule out like talking about past experiences. I think it's how you frame it. For me, it becomes less about like, we can't do this because of X. Like maybe talking about like, here are the places we've struggled in the past, and maybe there's different ways you could do it, but you're never trying to like close off a route or shut a door for someone because of something you've done in the past. Much more, like you say, it's showing them that you have been through this, and you kind of understand where they're kind of coming from is sort of the key thing.
The example that I gave once to the person I was managing, that they were happy I said to them, was like, it's okay to sometimes like get like emotional in a one-to-one. Like, if things aren't necessarily going well, if you're like thinking about leaving a job, if there are things like that are difficult, right? Like we are like humans. And I basically said, I was like, don't worry. I was like, I have cried in multiple one-to-ones because that's what I do sometimes. Sometimes my reaction is just to cry a little bit. And yeah, the person gave me good feedback of like, it actually made me realise that, it's okay to like show emotions. And I'm not saying you should cry in every one-to-one, but it's like, if things are difficult and things are tough and like that's how you as a person, like if that's what your natural reaction is, like you don't have to like hide everything. And yeah, like those are the sort of examples I feel like can be helpful, and things like, oh yeah, like, we do have some soft skills as engineers. It's things like giving advice, like, like I'm
not saying you don't. I'm just saying like
no soft skills for engineers, just tech. But no, like advice of like how I manage like reviewing versus like doing code, because that's quite often something that when you're on the more junior end of the scale, it can be really hard to be like, how do I know how much like work I should be doing versus work I should be reviewing? And my advice is always like, if you post one PR, just pick up another PR to review it. And it's like a really quite simple trick, but if you've not really put it in that frame before, it can be a little bit like, oh, and so it's not necessarily like shutting off doors and saying like, you have to do it this way. It's just like, try it out. Like those are the sort of things that are really interesting, of like things someone has tried that's worked for them, that then they can be like, hey, here's my suggestion.
I guess then finally, like, what advice would you give to someone looking to get into line management? And also like, how would you, like, what do you think are the ways that someone should decide if it's right for them or not?
That's hard. A piece of advice, I think, is using your first one-to-one as like a way to try and start getting to know the person. Like I found it really helpful being asked like a certain set of questions of like things like basic things like, how do you like to receive feedback? So for example, like I really like constructive feedback given to me directly. Like don't write it in a message because I will read it wrong and it will probably make me mad. Tell me in person so we can have a conversation about it, and I'm much more likely to take it well. And like talking about things like that in your first one-to-one so that you know these things before you need to do them. Other things like, when do you like your meetings? So that you don't end up with a one-to-one that's like, a Friday afternoon and you hate it. And instead it's sort of like in a helpful place. And these are the sort of like small things that can tailor the way you work with someone. And at first it's on a really small scale, but then it kind of naturally leads you into working out the person a little bit and working towards them. And in terms of like people considering it, I mean, if you're lucky enough to be at a job that will let you try it and do it for like one person, I think it's a really interesting way, because I think if you're just managing one person, if you really hate it, it'll be obvious very quickly. Some people will like find the one-to-one process uncomfortable and awkward. Some people will find like the growth check-in stuff super annoying and not want to do like, you know, quarterly or 6 monthly growth reports. I'd say the other thing is like explore what the other options are before just jumping into management. Like if you're looking to do it for progression, look at like what you can do that isn't management to progress and see if that's more interesting. Because it definitely isn't for everyone. And yeah, I mean, I'm excited to test having more than one report in the next couple of months to see if actually I would find it interesting to do that as a larger scale thing, or actually if no, I do kind of just want to stay with being an IC and maybe managing a person here or there to lend a hand, basically.
Yeah, I think that would definitely, like, in terms of, you know, is it right for you or not? I think I would definitely, if I could go back, like, just managing one person to begin with would be my ideal, to get a feel for it and be able to just focus on one person, just focus on one person's issues and like be able to support them as opposed to trying to support multiple people straight out the gate, because I think that is much trickier and you're having to deal with potentially two very different people as you're still learning like how your management style kind of works. Like because both those like people that reported into me needed very different approaches, and I hadn't even figured out one approach to begin with. So I really like that advice about like, you know, establishing some of the kind of framework for how your relationship with the person you're managing like kind of operates, because I think that is super key. Like one of the things I did was, you know, talked a bit about like where do we want to actually have these like one-to-one sessions, like, you know, did we want to get a meeting room and be in the office for them? I mean, this is back when people were always in the office. Or did we want to go out somewhere? Like, and most of the people I line managed like were super keen to just get out of the building. Like it kind of like reframed the thing. And also like I made a real like attempt to try and make notes of stuff. Less so like when we were chatting, I would like ask like, do you want me to take notes while we're chatting, or are you happy for me to like go away and write up some notes afterwards? And always making sure I had the time immediately after a one-to-one to do that, so it was still fresh and I could get things down. Because I think the big advice I'd give is like make sure you follow up on stuff. Like I've had too many like for me like poor one-to-ones are when you meet your line manager and it feels like every time you're kind of like you say, getting asked the same questions like, how are things going, what can I help with, and not actually having that kind of like, hey, last time we met you were, you know, kind of struggling a little bit with this, how is that going, did any of the things that, you know, we sort of talked about help in any way? Being able to like make it always feel like it's the next part in a conversation, I think will help you to build up that rapport. And also, I guess the final thing would just be, it will take time. Like, it's like any relationship, right? You are going to have to, you know, work at it. It is not going to be like, great, week one, you had a great one-to-one and everything's good. It's like, no. It will change and it will evolve as they get a bit more involved in the work, as they move out of the onboarding process, and maybe, you know, they're not speaking to the members of the people team as much anymore. Maybe there's more expectations because they've been in the job now for, you know, 3 months, 6 months, whatever the case may be. And so there's more of an expectation that they know how things work, which often isn't the case. Like I've definitely been at jobs where 6 months in, I'm still learning about how certain things operate. So I think that'd be kind of like the key. As for like whether line management is right for people, I think it comes down to like what do you want to do? I think for designers in particular, are you actually interested in managing people would be like the key thing, because often, you know, the more once you start going down that path, like it often means you get more people to manage, and the more people you manage, the less time you have to work on like design work. And if you are really just passionate about the design work and that's what you want to do, management probably isn't going to be right for you. Maybe that senior step is trying to step into something a little bit more strategic. Maybe it's about being like principal or staff who kind of like owns design vision. But if you want to be doing some form of design work, like management maybe isn't the ideal path, which is kind of sort of what I've realised, and partly why I'm looking more at mentoring outside of work than managing people within work personally. But that's just me.
That makes sense. I'll work it out eventually. I've still got a few more years till I'm caught up with you to work out exactly what I'm looking for.
But yeah, I think that brings us to the end of things and kind of all we have time for this month. Next month we'll be turning our attention to trend chasing and kind of talking about whether being up on the new hotness can be a benefit or a distraction. So hopefully you'll join us then. But for now, goodbye.